All right. First of all, thanks so much, everyone, for coming out. As we were sort of talking about earlier, like half people here are people we know really well, and half other people we've never seen before in our lives, which is kind of our ideal audience. So hopefully you will see some people that you know and love, and meet some of you today. Today, basically, we can think of this night as sort of like everything about housing and housing finance that you wanted to know, but were afraid to ask, had no idea who to ask. These are some of like the people who really actually know this stuff, have been working probably, I would venture there's maybe at least 50 years of combined experience on building and developing housing on this panel, if not more than that. These are people who've been working in the trenches of homelessness and housing issues in LA for many decades. So I'll just introduce everyone. My name is Rysman, by the way, and I'm an artist and designer collaborating with LAPD for a few years now, and we have an upcoming exhibition, and this is sort of part of our learning process. We like to sort of learn in public with other people's questions and concerns folded into the mix so that we don't get kind of blinded by our own kind of preoccupations. So we kind of really hope that I'll sort of get the ball rolling with the conversation, but we hope that it's guided really by what are the things that you want to know and that you've been thinking about. So again, without further ado, just a very quick introduction. We have from here to there. This is Eric Aries, Manager of Homeless System Change for United Way of Greater Los Angeles. Molly Rysman, Housing and Homelessness Deputy Director for Sheila Kuehl. Jerry Jones, many years with Inner City Law Center, but currently Director of the Provider Alliance to End Homelessness. And they will probably be able to, maybe in their first statements, maybe tell us a little bit more about what those titles mean, what they've been doing. But I kind of have just 3 simple questions to kind of get things rolling. Basically think of it as, first one is, how does housing finance work right now? Second, what's your dream for how it could work? And then third is like, how would you imagine things, best case scenario, working in Skid Row if you're really trying to build truly affordable housing in truly meaningful amounts? Here, what would need to happen? And the backdrop for all of that is, of course, this ongoing, kind of, we were joking earlier that like it's sort of been an impending community plan for, a decade, maybe it seems like, where it's like, it's always like about to drop, and like now we sort of really have a draft we're looking at, so we'll be sort of looking at that, sort of thinking, is this enough? If not, what else do we need? All right, so I'll just roll it out with this first question, which is, and you can kind of all fill in this picture. How do we get money to build affordable housing and housing for low-income people presently? What's the current state of things? Like, where does that money come from? How does it get spent? I know it's a very big question, but maybe you could try to give us, like the bird's eye view. It's full of gaps. Is that okay?
Sure, I'll take the first stab. Eric's just like giving me the hard stare, so I guess I'm going to start us off. Maybe I should have just looked and stared at Jerry. So I've been listening to this really great podcast, White Lies. If anyone's heard it, it's fantastic. But they've been talking a lot in the podcast about how history shapes the present. And I think that's very much true when we look at affordable housing finance. We have some really weird tools that we use to build affordable housing. And we have these really weird tools because of this very, there's a lot of troubled history when it comes to affordable housing. And I think some of that troubled history comes from a very toxic relationship with land in this country, and the fact that this country was essentially founded on the genocide of Native Americans and taking their land, and then we took out all the profit we could possibly get out of that land via...
Getting you to hold the mic even closer to your mouth. Yeah.
There you go.
Like your long thoughts again.
Yeah. So anyway, I was just talking about this very toxic relationship with land, and who gets access to land, and who gets to benefit from land, and this long history of trying to use land for the greatest profit, and not for the community good, which then deeply shaped affordable housing policy in this country. We had our sort of half-alive efforts around public housing, starting with the 1937 Housing Act. By the 1970s, we had abandoned public housing and were starting to demolish it, never really funded or constructed it in the way that would really create quality homes for people. And then there was this constant sort of shift of, well, why can't the private sector do it? It shouldn't be the government providing housing for people. And we sort of went from public housing to the Section 8 program, which the idea of that was that, you know, instead of the government building housing, why don't we give money to private landlords, and they can provide housing better than the government. That didn't actually produce housing, and so then we created the low-income housing tax credit. And people's eyes like immediately glaze over when we talk about the low-income housing tax credit. Mine do too, even having worked in this for a long time. But I think just a few points to understand about the tax credit and why it's such a really weird system. So it came out of the 1986 Reagan Tax Reform Act. And they didn't trust HUD, so they decided to create this IRS program. So the tax credit is an IRS program where large corporations or institutional investors can buy tax credits to then defer their tax liability, and that purchasing of the tax credit then goes into financing housing. So it's this really convoluted process of how money flows. But that is the largest source of funding for affordable housing today, and that has really dictated how we build housing ever since. And that gets combined with other money. Generally, tax credits are anywhere from 40 to 60% of the funding you need to build a building, and then you have to get local and state money. So you hear a lot about Proposition HHH. Those are city dollars from a city parcel tax that then get leveraged to be used with tax credits to build buildings. There's other sources. One of the big sources right now is No Place Like Home, which is the Mental Health Services Act dollars. Some of that has been bonded against to create another local source. And there's a variety of these state, city, county sources that then get mixed with tax credits. But tax credits sort of dominate our system today because there's such a large portion of where the money comes from. But it's this very convoluted way that money flows. There's a lot of lawyers involved. When you're building a tax credit building, very, very complicated agreements, and really designed to protect the institutional investors more than anything. So that's part of the reason why it's slow, part of the reason why it's expensive, part of the reason that it's not at scale. Is we're using this pretty funky tool. No, I'm not against tax credits because we have nothing else to replace them right now, so we don't want to get rid of the one thing that is helping us produce housing, but it's a very funky tool that's really shaped by this very troubled history that sort of led to the creation of tax credits. And we haven't seen many other options emerge since they were created in '86. You guys want to jump in?
Sure.
That's why I let Molly go first. Because I was going to say tax credits, it's like 3 cents. Howdy, everybody. My name is Eric Gaddis. First of all views and opinions expressed tonight are mine alone. Just saying. So I also, in addition to tax credits, I think it's important to touch on redevelopments. And redevelopments is currently not the mechanism for producing funding now, but I think it plays an important role in what we understand to be affordable housing, specifically in downtown Los Angeles. And so I think it's a very fraught history and one that I'm not going to automatically endorse, but I think it's important to acknowledge that when the Community Redevelopment Agency of Los Angeles was still alive, it played a very critical role in the redevelopment of downtown LA. And the history of that is very complex and very, in some ways it's hard, right? Redevelopment was used as a tool, and I'm going to take a step back. I think I was actually going to start at the same place that Molly did, because we're talking a lot about the future and how we build housing for the future. I think it's instructive to think about the history of Los Angeles and including downtown LA as an example of that, because I think it actually informs where we're at now, where we're going, and opportunities and tools like tax increment financing or the CRA. And so, redevelopment was used as an excuse to clear the slum of Bunker Hill and redevelop that high crime area, right? Words that we hear now. But the CRA also was responsible for, at some point over the course of its 6 years of existence, supporting the building of 5,000 units of affordable housing, workforce housing, and permanent supportive housing. It is not a perfect tool by any means. It was a very flawed agency, and I can get into that later on, and what it could be if it was done differently. And similar to what Molly said, a lot of these are tools, and just like any tool, like public housing, which I'm a big proponent of. It's not the tool itself, it is how it's implemented and the terms in which it's carried out that dictate what it connotes for us. And I think I just wanted to express that, like, for a long time, redevelopment was a major tool, and a lot of affordable housing that we have preserved in LA, including downtown LA, is because of this area.
So, hi again, I'm Jerry Jones. I coordinate a coalition of homeless organizations across the county called the Provider Alliance. And I think those two explanations really cover nearly everything you would need to know about our current tools for producing affordable housing. The one thing I'll add is just how limited tax credits are. So the tax credit, the low-income housing tax credit, is a vital component of about 90% nationally of all the affordable housing that's created in the United States. It's only producing about 100,000 units nationally, much less here in California. So it's combined with other things, as Molly said, but I think virtually all of the AAA money we're spending, for instance, is part of developments that also rely on the tax credit. So the tax credit is the essential ingredient, and then you can combine AAA, and then you got to find maybe 25% somewhere else. But this has become the only really production program in the United States for creating affordable housing, and there's not much of it. So I said there's 100,000 units on an average year being created nationally with this low-income housing tax credit. We're missing about 7.2 million units of affordable housing nationwide. About 500,000 here in LA that don't exist, and that goes a long way to explaining Skid Row and the consequences of not having housing for people who need it. So that's been the big change. I'll add historically, the federal government recognized after the Second World War that if the public sector doesn't build affordable housing, no one does. The private sector certainly doesn't on its own. And so we had, in the 50s and 60s, a large investment of public housing, as you've heard. In the 60s, there were apartment buildings, privately owned apartment buildings that the federal government subsidized through what were called deep mortgage subsidies. But it's essentially using financing to incentivize developers to build stuff that's going to be affordable for a period of time, and then they get the building after a period of time. That also had problems. The Section 8 rental assistance program came after that. Congress then just kind of walked away from its responsibility, its sense of having to figure this out. And that was unfolding in the 1980s, which is when we developed the tax credit, 1986. There's been really nothing since of any scale or consequence coming out of Washington. And so the expectation has shifted to state and local governments to produce the housing that the federal government no longer produces.
Sorry. I say everybody.
One more thing.
I was just going to say, I think, and this is something we'll probably touch on later on as well, but I just always, especially recently, as we become more nuanced, I think, in our discussion of production as the tool that we just need more units. I think that when we talk specifically about production, it's always important to run the conversation, and what we're looking for is like long-term permanent homes for people and a net gain in that. And I think that we always have to ground that in a very, very important role of protecting the tenants in those units, because oftentimes some of the policies that are put in place to keep those units affordable are based on policies, and when those tenants are gone, so do those protections go on that unit. And I think also with preservation, a lot of the tools that we're talking about now are based off housing covenants. And so if a lot of these affordable housing units are funded by federal dollars or local dollars or just government dollars, they are required to stay affordable for a long period of time. But oftentimes, not forever. I know a lot of folks might have been hearing about the Hillside Villas, which is an affordable housing development that had a 30-year covenant, and all that means is that for 30 years, rents have to stay at a certain level, have to be affordable to people. And the owner, after that 30 years though, they can charge whatever they want. And so I think it's important we talk about how it's funded. It's also talk about like what are the terms of that. And 30 years sounds like a long time, 55-year covenants sound like a long time, but as long as housing is a commodity and we're trying to engage the private market and negotiating tools around that convoluted process, there's going to be loopholes, shortcomings to those policies. And I think the thing that I hope to underscore when we're talking about production is in terms of production and how that relates to overall, preservation and protection strategies for tenants. And all those things have to be always framed together in any conversation about any one of those things, especially now.
I swear we will get to that. But I do just also want to say, part of what happened with the shift from public housing to Section 8 to low-income housing tax credits is our standards also changed quite a bit. So when we built public housing, the way public housing is structured is you pay 30% of your income in rent, regardless of what your income is. So if you're on general relief and you're getting $221 a month, you might be paying $75, $76 a month in rent because you pay 30% of your rent no matter what. Section 8 structured the same way. One of the things you'll hear when people talk about tax credits is sometimes people say, well, tax credit buildings are really affordable because they also have a very convoluted way of calculating rents. And so they were structured in a way so that you build a unit aimed at somebody at a particular area median income. So the most common is 50% of the area median income. So you might be aiming to rent to somebody who's earning, I don't know what 50% of the area median income is today, right now, maybe 50, 60? 60 something. Yeah. I don't know, well, whatever it is. And then it's 30% of that sort of what you think that person's income is going to be. But you might have somebody move into that apartment. So let's say the area median income, 50% of the area median income is $50,000. You might have somebody move in who's earning $30,000 a year, but they still have to pay that rent. That's aimed at 30% of somebody who's making more money than they necessarily are. And that's why you'll hear of people, you can have people living in affordable housing who are actually very cost burdened. Because it might be below market, but it might not be affordable to that person because it's not based on that individual tenant's rent. It's a little different when we build supportive housing because we layer in project-based, generally Section 8, sometimes some other project-based subsidy. But for just straight traditional, what they call vanilla affordable housing, it's structured in this way where we abandon that true keeping to 30% of somebody's income going to rent. And what we know by study after study after study is anybody who's paying more than 30% of their income in rent is a cost burden, and it has actually very serious consequences for somebody to have to pay more than that of their income in rent. It creates a lot of instability in people's lives. So I just also wanted to clarify that because I think we moved to this very convoluted financing system and we moved away from true affordability, which was a huge, I think a huge mistake.
Great. Just so. Well, first of all, that was fantastic. That was like way more succinct and covered way more than I even dreamed that could be answered in such a vague and general question. So thank you for rolling with that. So you sort of raised the stakes as the second question through your addendums. So we're talking about like, what's our dream for financing new affordable housing? Maybe let's also add into the mix, like, and keeping it affordable, and also how much should people be paying for that? What's the ideal amount that someone should be paying for affordable housing, or what we're calling sort of like our goal of housing. So three related questions that are, I think, each probably worthy of an evening of discussion. But kind of if you could give us a similar kind of lay of the land, but a lay of the land is sort of like a dream world. What should our system look like? How would we pay for it? So whoever wants to answer
Jerry, do you want to start?
I'll start with part of what needs to happen. And there are materials in the corner that describe the DTLA 2040 plan. So this is not the full solution, but it's something the city can and should do, which is as it's rezoning downtown Los Angeles, it should require developers to build affordable housing. Los Angeles is one of the few cities, certainly the only city of its size, that doesn't have that requirement. 500 cities, counties have what's called inclusionary zoning, just by a show of hands. who's heard of inclusionary housing and inclusionary zoning? So I won't describe it in detail, but it's what you would expect. You include affordable housing in the development of what gets built by the private sector. There will be tens of billions of dollars in housing development over the next several years. There have been tens of billions of dollars in downtown housing development already. Los Angeles doesn't require in a serious way that that developers include affordable units with that investment on their part. It's not appealing to what developers ought to do. It's not expecting them to be philanthropic. It's actually just recapturing the value that the city is about to give. So as Skid Row and the environments of PLA are rezoned, someone's going to make a whole bunch of money. If you take land that's currently zoned for industrial use, and you say, well, now you can actually build high-rise housing on the same plot of land, whoever owns that land is going to make a whole lot of money.
Yes.
Right? So it's plowing in that added value that the city creates through its ability to rezone. Shouldn't that extra value be used for affordable housing for folks who have none?
Yes.
It's not keeping the developer from doing anything that would cost it money that it wouldn't otherwise an investor make. They get to build their housing, and then the extra value of that land that's created through public policy is used as the public needs it to be allocated, which is to folks who need housing. And so there's been an effort to insist that there be inclusionary zoning as a requirement for the rezoning of downtown Los Angeles. We want no net loss. What that means is there's also existing housing that's about to become very unaffordable, that right now, a few blocks from here, you can find an $800 apartment, a $600 apartment. In some of the side streets in Skid Row, there's affordable housing right now. Without papering a single kitchen or painting a closet or anything, those units are about to get a lot more expensive, as is because more valuable housing is being put up nearby. So we want a mechanism so that there's a way to insist that if you're going to build in Skid Row, we can't lose any of the affordable housing that currently exists as we're creating new affordable housing. And then I'll say, and this is to the point of affordability that Molly mentioned, even with inclusionary zoning, we still need some way of buying down the rent for the folks who live in Skid Row now. So inclusionary zoning can get you moderate income or what's called below market rents. It still won't be affordable to someone who has zero income or someone who's on GR. So if we open up Skid Row and the other parts of downtown LA for development, we want developer fees or some way of capturing the value, and there are mechanisms for doing this, that also go into rental subsidies for the current residents of Skid Row. And I think that's probably the most important point to try to make is, if this were any other part of town, if this was Bel Air or Brentwood, there's no way they would rezone and rewrite the community plan for someone else to move into their neighborhood, and they've got to leave, right? It's understood that the community plan ought to serve the community that exists, but somehow that isn't the perspective right now on how downtown Los Angeles is being rezoned.
Yeah, I just want to add a few things about what I'd like to see in the future. One thing, so we've got to think about affordability. What does affordability really mean? How do we create housing that's truly affordable to people? We also have to think about perpetuity. There is no reason, when you're not using tax credits, to do covenants that are time limited. And this is where history shapes the present. Again, the way the linkage fee is structured in the city of LA, which is sort of a backhanded way of trying to do inclusionary zoning, is that you may be required to provide affordable units, but they only have to be affordable for 55 years. There is no financial incentive that developer gets in the present that helps them build the building, because someday those units are going to revert to market. It's just a giveaway to the developer when the units turn over and the covenant ends. There's no reason at all in inclusionary zoning policies to have covenants and not have it be in perpetuity.
Could you actually just back up a second and just explain the linkage fee for people who don't never heard of it?
I will do my best. So actually, one of the reasons I ended up in this work is I was really interested when inclusionary zoning was first proposed in the city. So in 2003, Andreas and Eric Garcetti, then council members, proposed inclusionary zoning, which was really exciting. We've seen in cities that have had inclusionary zoning for a long time that it really helps create an inclusive city, so it was great that this was being proposed. At the time, it was vehemently beaten back. It did not pass. It was never even brought up for a vote. It was debated or sort of talked about in back channels for a couple of years. The neighborhood councils played a big role in making sure this did not move forward because people didn't want affordable housing in their communities. It was a huge loss that we didn't get that policy because had it been enacted in those years, we would have thousands more affordable units today. Unfortunately, it did not move forward at that time. Then there was a ballot measure. I used to work for Eric Garcetti, and then we did something called Prop H in 2006, because the idea was, well, if we can't do it through inclusionary zoning, and this was pushed by the Central City Association, they said, let's do a bond, let's tax people, and you'll build affordable housing. And it did not win because we have Prop 13, and we had to get 2/3 of the vote, so Prop H passed by 64%, but that wasn't enough, because you actually needed 67%, so 64% then it failed. So out of that, they started working on an EIR to do a linkage fee and a study about a linkage fee. And so the idea of a linkage fee is when somebody builds, they create the need for the people who work in a building or have jobs associated with that building. There's a need for affordable housing connected to those jobs. It's a really weird thing what the linkage is. And so you should either pay a linkage fee to cover the need for that affordable housing or build the housing on site. So right now, developers in the city of LA can choose to either build affordable housing in their building or they can pay the linkage fee. And I don't work for the city of LA, so I can't tell you how they calculate the linkage fee. Oh, Eric can tell you how they calculate the linkage fee.
Sorry. I worked at the Los Angeles Community Action Network at Lakeland for about 7 years. It was one of the last things they would work on was the linkage fee. And the way they work, the way they calculate it is very complicated. But essentially, it's a fee system that's based off of square footage. $8 to $18 for residential buildings, multifamily that are 8 units or more. There's also a fee for non-residential commercial development. And just to make things more complicated, the city was split up into zones because there was a fear that if you put a linkage fee in areas that need developments, it wouldn't allow development to happen. So it's actually zones. So in high production zones like downtown LA, you want to capture the value. And so the fee in those areas is much higher than in, say, South LA or parts of the valley where there's less development happening. And so I don't know exactly how, but it's like a complicated formula where the city's split up into 3 different types of areas, and the fee is based off of both commercial and residential housing. It's based off square footage. That money goes into a trust fund essentially that is theoretically supposed to produce $100 million a year, but it was also deferred for a period of time. So it was a phased project where it was going to go into place over a number of months over the course of a year and a half. So it's not fully implemented until actually probably around now.
Okay, yeah, now back to our scheduling,
Okay,
regularly
back to the
scheduled
original
programming.
question.
Sorry
A few
about
things
that.
about what I'd love to see. I would love to see us do lots more preservation. There have been different ways people try at preservation. We do some preservation. I'd love to see us do a lot more preservation, not only preservation of units with covenants that are expiring, but the naturally occurring affordable housing, which we're losing like crazy. Because we've created all these financial incentives for people to buy up buildings that haven't been maintained, and then they kick everybody out and repaint and put in some chrome fixtures and triple the rent. There's a lot of incentives in the way our housing market's structured right now that makes that very appealing to investors. And we're losing an incredible stock of naturally occurring affordable housing. But just a couple other things, if we're really talking about our dream world, because you use that word dream. I mean, one, I would really like to see government build housing again.
Thank you.
I believe I used to work for Skinner Housing Trust. There's a lot of amazing private, nonprofit developers doing amazing work. that I really appreciate, but I also feel like to ever get to scale, we're really going to have the government play a much bigger role. I would love to see us preserve our public housing. I would love to see us expand our housing. The closest I've been able to figure out how to get is just to try and get the county to buy as much land so we can ensure that it's affordable in perpetuity. I've been spending a lot of time trying to buy land lately. But a couple other things. I mean, I think we want to build big buildings, and that's wonderful, but I'm also interested in what we can do at a smaller scale. So another sort of dream that I'd really like to see us move towards is what Minneapolis has done, which is getting rid of single-family zoning. Because what we know, I mean, single-family zoning, horrible racist history. The reason we have single-family zoning was the idea that if we require that people can only build a house on a lot of a certain size, it would only be people with resources, aka white people. That is the history of single-family zoning, why it was created. It has this really gnarly history. And what we know is that if we allowed people to be able to, just take pieces of land that a family might own, an individual might own, we could actually unlock a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing. I love accessory dwelling units. If you haven't been following what's been happening in California with accessory dwelling units, it's actually what's having the biggest impact on our production right now. There's all this talk about big bills and transit-oriented communities. It's a great program. But I'm also just excited to see individual homeowners who are like, hey, what if I take my garage and turn it into a studio apartment and rent it out for $1,200? And we're seeing an incredible wave of homeowners doing that. And what I'd love to see is get to a point where it's not just ADUs, but maybe we allow up to 4 classes on every single family lot. And that would actually unlock a tremendous amount of potential. So I think there's a lot of different ways to get at this issue. And we've got to sort of let go of some of the traditional ways we've done this and really think about how to really unlock the potential and allow everyday people to participate in the production of affordable housing.
So I was going to mention ADUs. I was mention public housing and preservation. So I'll try to add a little bit to that, but no, I totally full-fledged endorse Paul's idea. I think ADUs, basically any single-family home now can build an ADU by right, essentially on their property. That is not a privilege that everyone has, but it's a privilege that upwards of 2-3 million people who have single-family homes can do, and you could instantly have like a huge impact relative to what production usually is. And that alone, it will be both naturally reoccurring affordable housing as there's more units online, or there's programs to incentivize on top of that. So by exchanging the use of that unit to somebody who has a housing subsidy or who is formerly experiencing homelessness, you give incentives to even expedite the building of that or even give financial assistance. So I think that's huge. I think preservation is like massively important. And I know this is about production, and again, I underscore that I think preservation is just so important because we know when the land's gone in a commodified housing market, we lose so much. The reason why Skid Row has been able to stay, the reason why Skid Row Housing Trust and SRO has been able to have an impact and redevelop or rehab existing units is because people fought to preserve Skid Row. Right? And if there was no Skid Row fight to preserve it, there would have been not opportunity to even have a fight to preserve Skid Row and to use that property and those lands for housing, for land trust. I think is another huge tool that should be explored. Just other tools. I think I have a dream, and so the dream I have is very similar to theirs. I'll speak a little bit to sort of what are ideas currently that kind of bridge that gap. I think ADUs or accessory dwelling units is one of them. I think community land trusts is another model for that. I think in downtown, there's a couple of tools that I think are underutilized in the existing kind of to bridge that gap between now and the dream is the transfer floor area ratio ordinance. Essentially, folks who don't know, this is another eyes gloss over thing, but it's a very key thing, which is basically properties in downtown LA that haven't utilized all their development rights, right? Haven't built up as much as they can, i.e. the Staples Center, the Convention Center, the LA Library. They have more right to build, but they're not going to, right? We want the library there. And so there's a program that was put in place in 1979 to sort of allow the selling of those air rights to other properties who can build bigger on those lands. And in doing so, when they do that, they have to pay a fee, right? It doesn't need to buy it, they just need to have it. They pay a fee for public benefits. and the buyer gets to build higher. The seller gets to preserve their building basically because now they can't build any higher, and so the prospect of them having desirability in terms of purchase is not there. And the city gets public benefits. And to say that this is like a massive amount of money is like an understatement, right? So there's a couple projects. Just for example, on 4th and Olive, there's a big project. Just the fee, the public benefits fee for the project was $18 million. There's a project, the Metropolis, I think it's on 7th and Hill, $8 million. So this is like hundreds of $millions that get put into basically public benefits, and the public benefits are like a lot of things. They can basically be, for the most part, spent at the discretion of largely the council member. And so those resources over the years have gone to things like the Bringing Back Broadway redevelopment. They go to different projects around economic development or jobs, arts programs, all things that are justifiable and like important or technically public benefits. But at a time when there's such, like when housing is literally the most important issue in our city, it is a underutilized tool to use that money for preserving units, to creating units, and just overall like a missed opportunity that I think is important. I think there are tools like a vacancy tax that I think should be explored. Councilmember Bond has a motion in this week to report back to explore the feasibility of a vacancy tax. The vacancy rate in the county of LA is around, you would know, it's probably 3.5 or 4%. You know this? Lower now, even lower now. But, however, in downtown LA, in 2017, it was around 12%. As recently as 2018, it's around 10%. And so, when we have places in downtown LA that are building exorbitant amounts of luxury housing, and it's not being utilized, we need to incentivize people to either fill those units or to stop building those units. And so you either pay the tax, or maybe we just build less of those units, and those units should be built for lower affordability. So I think that's like a tool, again, a tool, not the dream, but something that could be put in place to help either mitigate the like crazy speculation that's happening, or to create resources to build affordable housing. Sorry, I was really worked up this morning. But basically, my big takeaway, my dream is definitely public social housing. I think it was a failure of the federal government and how it was handled. It was by design sabotaged, and I think that we need to explore that option not just on a federal level but on a local level. I think government buying land and figuring out ways to use it is a huge opportunity and very important. So I think the dream there is, given the crisis, given the scale and severity of the housing situation, we have to be bold and think about like just removing like land and housing as a commodity, and we can't do that across the economic system. We should at least be able to do it and have an option for government to own that money and to house people.
Awesome, thank you so much. I think I'm really eager to get to all of your questions, so I'm gonna kind of maybe just throw out my question as sort of like a little spice that to like suggest like try to answer my question by answering other people's questions as they come up, but bring this all back to bear, and you've already done this in various ways, but thinking about Skid Row in particular, what can we do in this situation now to push towards these kind of more ideal versions of housing? So that's something, if you can try to address, like, is there a local solution? Does it even make sense to be thinking about it on the scale of Skid Row? And if so, what are the things that can be implemented at that scale to really build units? But let's have some questions from your group. I don't have a good protocol for how to do this, but I'll just do it in order as I saw them left to right. Okay, so first you, sir.
I believe that the title of the panel was how to build 7,000 units in Skid Row.
That's Ross's plan.
House.
Okay, so
Yeah.
do each of you have an answer to that? Of how we could build today 7,000 housing units, and what would they cost, and how much would people, and what would they cost to rent or buy, or how that would work?
Thank you, audience plant. That was the question that I nixed, so I feel now perfectly satisfied. So yeah,
I'll take a stab at it with a very quick response. Yes, it is very possible to build 7,000 units through, one example would be the inclusionary zoning Is this supposed to
Is the inclusionary zoning, that's not in place?
Inclusion, the mandatory requirement that developers have to include affordable units with what they're gonna build anyway is not in place. If it were in place, the DTLA 2040, but this whole exercise is because they are projecting about 70,000 units of housing is gonna be built between now and 2040. 70,000, 125,000 new residents in downtown Los Angeles. Most cities that have inclusionary zoning, the requirement's more than 10%. If we got 10% of that 70,000 figure and made it affordable to the people who live here, yes, it is not only doable, but it's a debate that's happening right now. And if we don't weigh in, we'll be looking back at this moment a decade or two from now and say, why didn't we, at a time when this is not a controversial place to build tall buildings. It's harder to do this in some of the neighborhoods of LA. There's not really neighborhood resistance to the idea of affordability. There's actually a lot of support for affordability. And there's developer interest to build it here. Why? And to your other point, it costs us nothing. This is why 500 other places do this. It costs City Hall nothing out of its own pockets to require inclusionary zoning. It's simply reallocating the value we're creating through the land use decisions, and it's requiring the developers who frankly built the stuff quicker than a lot of nonprofits to put it in their buildings.
So your answer is pass inclusionary zoning, and you can get this to the 7,000.
It would be 10% of what's going to go up in price.
I would just add that I think what we should be focusing on is creating 7,000 affordable units. Because I think you can do that through inclusionary zoning, you can do that through building housing, and preservation has to be a really critical tool. So I would like to see a lot more buildings that are preserved as affordable housing, and covenants preserved and covenants added. Because I think that could also really help us get to that 7,000 number.
Do you know how if you did those things that you just, would that get us to 7,000?
Yes.
Preserving affordable units?
Yeah, the other thing I just want to say also about sort of my dream world and what I really hope we'll be fighting towards in the future is Section 8 can be a really valuable tool. So right now in America, only 1 in 4 people who qualify for Section 8 get it, which is crazy because in most of the Western world, when you have a benefit like that, it's an entitlement, which means if you're below a certain income, you get the benefit. This is our only benefit to help poor people that we ration in this completely irrational way. So I also think that that's something we really got to be fighting for, and if we did that, that would also really be an incredible tool to preserve housing, to build affordable housing, to be a really important tool if we sized that program to be an entitlement the way it really should be.
I just, a couple additions to that. I echo what Jerry and Molly said. I'll just add, just in terms of tactics, in terms of feasibility, inclusionary zoning is something that is often cited as a desirable policy. And I think when it comes to political feasibility, we always hear like, well, that's going to stifle development, or that's going to actually have an adverse effect and lead to less production. And you know, I met Molly during one of the versions of that mixed income housing inclusionary zoning battle, and it's always like, it's going to lead to a downturn. We can't do this. It's not the right time. It's not the right time. And then the recession happened. And then when recessions happen, well, then we definitely can't do it now because we can't do it. We have to actually we have to get development going again. And so we kind of make an excuse at any corner. And so it is feasible. It should be pursued. It is pursued in other cities, not just across the country, but in Southern California, different cities. Santa Monica being one of them, where there's a mandatory, has to be another one, West Hollywood, where building multifamily housing is required. 10%, you know, it's usually on a sliding scale depending on affordability, but a requirement of that, and in no other, and in downtown LA, just as an example, where development is developing at the highest rate, it's a given in terms of how that could work. I did also comment on preservation. I think that's huge. I think when we talk about 7,000, it's about affordable units. It's also about a net gain of 7,000 units, right? Because we're not going to keep building it up. We have to concentrate on like, you can build 7,000 units, but at what cost? And where are you building those units? And I think that's important to note, and I think we have to protect the units that are there. Part of that formula is making sure that policies that are in place to preserve those units are enforced and making sure that they're carried out. And so there is a residential hotel preservation ordinance that basically was put in place in 2008 to basically preserve residential hotels in downtown LA. Actually across the city, but in downtown LA, there are about 7,500 residential hotels, units. Those are units that have to be replaced one for one if somebody buys that property and redevelops that property. That had a couple of effects. It stopped residential hotels from being built and redeveloped and losing that affordability. But it also had the effect of certain property owners bought that land, didn't know, and have essentially been land banked. Some of those lands. So some of those hotels, the Morrison Hotel being one of them down in South Park, those have been 80 MC units since 2008. Those are currently actually being developed now. There's going to be replacement units built. The Cecil Hotel right on Main Street, there's 301 units that for a long time have just been laid mostly vacant. So there's estimates, I tried to get the numbers today, but I couldn't, but I think there's at least 500 to 1,000 sort of empty residential hotel units that are just empty. And we have to figure out a way to unlock that because they're empty because they're preserved, which is good. But then how do we reach that sweet spot where we can actually get those units back up and running and not at the cost of losing that affordability? And I just think that is part of the pie too, is just how do we preserve those units so that we're not just producing units at the expense of units that we're losing.
I'd like to say something concerning, when it comes to developers buying up all of this land, like you said, in the Skid Row area, factory areas where they're going to make a killing, like you said, they need to be, for all the people that they're going to displace in that community, they need to buy, whether they have to go, because they're gonna be making a killing and it's nothing to them. They can go into communities and buy old renovated buildings, renovate them and fix them up for the people and make it low income. And we need to make it so that if you're gonna get this property at a cheap price, you're gonna be building luxury high-rise buildings for everything, then you're required to, for every person that you displace in that community, you're required to go into wherever you want to do it, but you're gonna either build the building yourself, a low-income building to put these people in, or you're gonna go and you're gonna look all throughout the city, get abandoned buildings, fix them up, and make it for the people. This is how you get the people, because they have the money. They definitely have the money. They're gonna make a killing off of that. But we need to make sure that we don't just give them the land and let them do whatever and we get screwed in the end. We need to make sure and say, no, you have to do this. I don't mind, we're developing, great. We're developing, but we need to make sure, and this other thing about, because after 50 years, then you turn around and you bring it back to market rate, that's not helping people that are low income. That makes no sense. When that 50 years comes and now it's time for remarketing, then what you need to put in that contract is, okay, we're gonna remarket, but guess what? For all the people you're gonna displace, you're gonna have to buy, you're gonna have to put them somewhere, you're gonna have to build, or you're gonna have to put them somewhere. This is how we do it. That's common sense. That's how you help the people, and that's how you not lose housing. That's how we do it. And that's what we need to do, and we need to advocate. As we all are here together, we need to make sure that you don't just give land away like that and without having them. There's so many abandoned buildings, post offices that are closed down and everything that can be renovated, that can be fixed, that property that we can do something with, and they have the money to do it, let them do it and work things out, because that's how it's gonna be done.
So, thank you, Joe.
Yes.
No, shout out to Joe. So just to add to that briefly, and I'll go to the next question. I really appreciate Joe saying that, because I think when you're hearing from us today, like, these are great ideas. We didn't invent a lot of ideas. They have existed for a very long time, and depending on political opportunity, and more importantly, resistance and organizing, that's what makes the difference. And so I think what you're hearing today are ideas that have been at different times explored, have had some concessions or wins, have been implemented but not implemented correctly. But I think it's always worth underscoring that no matter what, just like the preservation and protection of Skid Row in the 70s, just like any a fight against displacement and othering of in our city, the resistance has to always be underscored in organizing and taking the ideas and making them happen through people who are impacted. Leading those efforts is always important to underscore.
Great. Of course, dying to ask a follow-up, but I'm gonna keep on going down this queue. I think, yeah, we'll just kind of go here, here, and then there.
There's no question.
Okay, and then we'll come back to here. All right.
Yeah, I came down here to get an answer to 7,000 homeless people housing now. Now, I have a feeling that the proposition HHH that I voted for has been a failure. Housing vouchers are no longer accepted. I tried to get on Section 8, but they said there's no Section 8 availability, and there may not be for another 50 years. Mayor City wants to have homelessness ended by the time the Olympics are here. So, what's being done now? Today, plans are good, have to be implemented, they have to plan for the future, but what's being done today?
I want to talk about Proposition Triple H and what's being done today and what's being done with Measure H, but I do just also want to frame this because I think there are some really good programs and there are thousands of people getting help, which is really important because every single person who gets that help is transformative for their lives. But what we're up against is so significant, and it is global forces that without working within a framework of legal entitlements, legal protections for everybody who's at risk, our programs are not having the impact that I think the voters wanted them to have when they voted for Triple H and they voted for Measure H. And like I said, there is really good data. And I think what's failing us is actually the media, because the media is having a heyday, getting likes on online articles by trashing really good work that's happening. So Triple H is building thousands of units. Like I said, it's with tax credits. It takes some time. We're just starting to see the first of the Triple H units open. But I know just in the last 3 years in the county, because I work for the county, so I know the county numbers better than I know the city numbers, but in the county, 3 years ago we opened about 300 supportive housing units. Last year, or 2 years ago, we opened about 500. This year we're on track to open 1,000 supportive housing units. So we're seeing a tripling of the units that are opening. Most of those were funded before Triple H, and that's the thing about the reporting is Doug Smith is never going to give credit for a lot of good work that happened before Triple H and is resulting in units opening today. There's a real culture of gotcha in the media right now, but there is actually good work happening, and people are getting help. Most people are actually getting out of homelessness without supportive housing. Where we see the biggest numbers is in the rapid rehousing program. So last year, the estimates are that about 21,000 people got off the streets. Some of those people got off the streets with supportive housing, some of those people got off with Section 8, but you're right, the Section 8 waiting list is closed for anyone new trying to get on that waiting list, which is why Section 8 needs to be an entitlement and not this crazy rationed program. A lot of people got off the streets with rapid rehousing assistance, which is short-term rental assistance. And there were a lot of people who just needed a little bit of help. They might have just needed help paying the security deposit, or they might have needed help reuniting with family that they could live with. There's a lot of people who got very limited assistance and were able to self-resolve homelessness, because that's the majority of folks who get off the streets. So good things are happening, but our vision is not radical enough to create the change we need to see. And so those programs are good. They're doing what they said they were going to do in terms of the number of people they're helping. Triple H will create, ultimately, there will be 10,000 units of supportive housing, but that's not enough without it being a much broader framework of legal protections and entitlements.
First of all, I want to thank the panel. I appreciate all the hard work you have done for Skid Row. I'm very familiar with each one of you, what you have done, but it's not enough. It's not enough. When you talk about Triple H spending $10 billion, 1,000 people have been housed, that's not enough. When you talk about 56,000 homeless in LA County and 36,000 right here in Skid Row, that's not enough. We need to see things differently. And I have 3 white elephants I want to put in this room, and each one of you can answer those questions for me. How we can work together, how we can unite, how we can become a family, and how we can make the community see things differently to change this. 1, where is the accountability for that $10 billion? I'll let you answer that. How did it spend, and why is there no accountability for the mistakes we made? Why isn't there, this is what we did, and this is what we're going to do differently to change that? I'd like for you to address that. Number 2, they're going to reduce Skid Row by 40% with that new housing plan. 40%. That means those people that are now going to get those properties at a low rate are going to make billions. And when they do build, only 10% is going to have to go to low-income housing. 10%, that should be 50%. Why is it such a low percentage? I'll let you go with that. Number 3, what we're talking about here in Skid Row is we're saying the homeless people are useless. The homeless people are just taking taxpayers' money. With awesomeness comes a way out of darkness. And that's what I love about the Los Angeles Poverty Department. Urban Voices, Studio 526. They give creativity which regains its dignity for the homelessness. I lost my business of 23 years. I employed 200 people when I was wrongfully denied my SSI. And that can happen to any of you senior citizens in this room. It can happen to everybody. So many people are just one paycheck away from losing their homes. It takes the average person who works minimum wage 75 hours a week to afford a one-bedroom apartment. Skid Row needs to be different. We are #1 in the nation. What we do here, the whole world is looking for us. What can we do collectively to make a change so that we each can see step by step? I love big dreams. I don't think if I dream big enough, then it's not meant for me, because dreams should be scary. But I'm talking about reality. I'm talking about right now in Skid Row. What can we do reality-wise to get the homeless off the street? Because right now, I just interviewed a 74-year-old woman. Her name is Leanne Levitt. She's a cat lady. She feeds cats all over. She's been beaten for the 7th time. I've been beaten 8 times. They call me the Elephant Man because my face is so big because of the ways I've been beaten. We're being beaten. We're being used. We're being abused. What can we do with the people on the street? I'll take it to you.
Respond to him, and then I'll leave it to the
We'll get to you.
and I'll be brief on Triple H, and maybe begin with just acknowledging the coalition I helped lead, champion Triple H, and so I think in the efforts to make sure that passed and to build support for it, we probably overpromised what it will do. It is intended to build 10,000 units of supportive housing for folks who need not just affordability, but the services to help them either deal with disabilities or long-term problems. It will reach that goal. It's going to take a number of years. We're actually building supportive housing in Los Angeles a little faster than a lot of parts of the nation. I lived in the District of Columbia before I moved here. DC's first supportive housing project, about 120 some units, took 8 years from the time they funded it or began funding it to when they opened their doors, because DC City Hall has no experience with supportive housing. LA, it's a lot harder than it should be, but it is what you would expect in terms of the pace of nonprofit housing development. I think nationally it's probably in the range of 4 to 5 years. Using tax credits again, cobbling together all the other resources. So I guess the other point related to that is it's 10,000 units. We've got 60,000 homeless people in the county. So the question becomes, how do you get 60,000 people into 10,000 units? And the answer is you don't. That Triple H is not a full response to the homelessness crisis. It's not intended to serve the majority of homeless people who don't need permanent supportive housing. They need help with the rent. They need somewhere to stabilize, regroup, and get on with their lives. And most of them are doing that and self-resolving. They're getting out of homelessness with no help because there is no help for most people in LA who are falling into homelessness. And so unless and until we deal with the rental housing crisis, which is a much bigger conversation, but is at the end of the day it's the driving force of why there are 60,000 people with nowhere to go, and it's the only solution to how we end homelessness.
How about the accountability? How about bringing that up, Jerry? I really want to know, why is it never discussed what we're doing wrong so that we can learn from our mistakes? Nobody admits what is wrong. So how can we correct it if nobody admits what's wrong?
Well, I'll go for just 1 minute longer to say we need to be accountable to ourselves. And I, as a longtime housing advocate, I think the thing that perplexes me about housing advocacy is we're one of the few sectors on a social issue of this magnitude who is not asking the right people to solve the problem. My wife works at CHIRLA, which is an immigrant rights organization. They go in Washington, D.C. at the Supreme Court because they understand it's the Supreme Court, it's the federal government that sets federal immigration policy. The healthcare advocates, when they fought for the ACA, they didn't go state by state. They went to Washington because Washington's the only place that's got $110 billion a year to solve the affordable housing problem, the affordable care problem. And on and on. The LGBT community understood if you want marriage equality, you've got to go to Washington. If you want to fix don't ask, don't tell, you've got to get Congress to vote for that. So I just said earlier in this panel, we have a shortage of 500,000 units just in LA. Anyone who can do simple math would know that $250,000 a unit, which is very low, that's not what it actually costs. But if we could do that for 250,000 units, that's $125 billion. That's being accountable to ourselves, to recognize it's the federal government is the only place that has the kind of money to solve the problem, not just in LA, but nationwide. This is a national crisis.
Worldwide.
There are folks who are on the streets in every major city of this country. And only Washington can fix this problem, and Washington created the problem.
Correct.
We know this. So I don't want to go on too long on this point, but I think accountability goes both ways. If we're serious about solving homelessness, we need a strategy that we know will work. And we need to demand the city to do what it ought to do, because land use policy is in its purview. But if we need the resources to solve homelessness, we're not going to get it locally.
I just want to say a couple of points on that. Elections really matter.
Yeah.
Tremendously.
Thank you.
And elections matter at the federal level, but they also matter at the local level. And who represents this community on the city council plays a tremendous role. And that should be something that everybody is thinking about. If you really care about the community, you've got to think about your local representatives and who they are, and getting the right people who are focused on equity into these positions, because that has not been the criteria of how people get elected to the city council. I also just want to say, I really want to reframe this, because actually what we know is that it's more like 150,000 people in a year experience homelessness. The 60,000 figure is the point in time count from one night on one evening in January.
Done by volunteers.
It's a much larger proportion of people who experience homelessness in any given year. And if all we had to do was house the people on the streets today, we would actually finish this with the resources we have. The issue is 150 people a day become homeless. 150 people a day. That is staggering. We've got to close the front door to homelessness, and that means working much broader upstream. Because I think a lot of people look at what's happening on the streets today and they say, oh my God, homeless system, what are you doing? This is crazy. There's encampments everywhere. People are facing violence. People are living in terrible conditions. People don't have access to bathrooms. You know, what are you doing, homeless system? And the homeless system is actually doing more than ever to help people. Is it enough? No, absolutely not. But if it was just the people out there today, this would be very solvable.
It grows.
But the challenge is that 150 people a day becoming homeless. And how do we help them stay in their homes? How do we help them fight eviction proceedings? We've been working on right to counsel in the county and in the city. How do we help people when they're facing a financial crisis because of an unexpected car repair, or a loss of a job, or a split up of a family, or kids who are ending up in the foster care system to become, able to sustain themselves when they get out of the system? It's a much bigger upstream issue. So we can talk about the 60,000, which is important, but the real question, if we really want to see things change, is how do we stop that inflow into homelessness? And that's much bigger and much broader.
Okay, what do we do now?
I would just,
And then I want to get through the queue.
Sure.
I know that there's lots of questions, but I think it's going to be 1, 2, 3. So we'll get to all of you, and then I feel like after that, I can't promise that we have time. We'll see how fast we can get through these questions, but those are the 3 we're going to do.
sure. I will just, I say I 100% agree with what I'm saying. I think, as Molly was saying, about 100 people falling into homelessness. And so when we say we're housing out people are saying, well, I don't see the difference. They're like, we're actually housing 133 people every day are exiting homelessness. But there's just a math problem. It's just like if people are becoming homeless, and I do think it's important to zoom out and say it's bigger than just the one-time count, and also how many people are rent burdened who are becoming homeless, right? So how many people are paying more than 50%, more than 90% of the rent on income, and that's why it has to be a bigger, more comprehensive approach that includes rent control, that includes repealing Casa-Hawkins, that includes permanent tenant protection for folks they don't lose their homes, emergency rental assistance to keep people inside, because when they become homeless and they're on the streets, people get sicker and it becomes more challenging for folks to exit homelessness. And so the only thing I'll add to that, and I wasn't planning on speaking to this, I think that to honestly answer your question about what do we do now for folks who are on the streets.
What can we do?
I think there has been things come up around the right to shelter, and I think people have talked about, there should be a right to shelter like in New York City. The program costs $2 billion every year just to operate. That including how much it would cost to build that shelter. I think it's absolutely, everyone knows, absolutely horrible the conditions that folks have to live in on the streets, and I think it's super challenging. I also think that it's taken so long to have people agree that long-term solutions and building housing is the key. It took decades to do that, and we have to figure out how to keep doing that without diverting resources from that. And I do think that involves, and I'll get into detail about how to talk about afterwards, figure out creative ways to support our homeless neighbors on the streets. That involves public health infrastructure, that involves basic sanitation services. They shouldn't be there permanently, by no means.
Water.
By no means. But if we are going to keep saying, don't worry, hold on, your long-term solution is coming, that doesn't help the person that's supposed to live there one day that's on the streets right now, and we have to figure out how to.
3 homeless bodies.
In the meantime, yes, 100%. And I think in the meantime, we have to figure out how to balance our long-term vision and never stray away from that, with trying to figure out what we do in the intermediate. And I think that we have to be aware of things that could sound good, and I'm very skeptical of the right to shelter kind of idea, because it will cost so much and not end that person's homelessness. It brings them in, and that's not something we should overlook, but the long-term vision, we have to stay on that path. We have to figure out the proportion of resources to support our homeless neighbors while they're experiencing.
So work with us, tell us what we need to do. So collectively, we can vote on the right people. Collectively, we can do the things together. It's not all up to you. We want to be involved, but none of us know what to do.
Yeah, I would say there's 2 things to that. I would say, I actually think there is a fair amount of accountability. I think the ultimate accountability is elections as a tactic, right? It's like, not that they're not I'm not here to say well, your elected leaders, they're going to be the best people all the time. But unfortunately, in this climate, there is plenty of oversight of HHH. There's plenty of people who know where that money is going. But ultimately, these elected, city council has an enormous amount of power in the city of LA. And then the other accountability, the other piece of what you can do is I actually think land use and the community plan, the 2040 community plan, is a huge, huge moment. It's going to set policies in place that are going to inform the next 50 years. And as we know, every time the city does this, they don't necessarily jump to the people first who are most in need and say, what do you think? Who should make these policies? They speak for 125,000 people that they expect to grow in downtown LA, not necessarily people who are currently there. We need to make sure that those are the folks who are driving that policy, because we say that we shouldn't produce inside the Skid Row, because we know every time that happens, we lose a little bit of the community. And not just the numbers of people, but actually the community itself, which is so important to work.
Okay. This conversation is obviously much bigger and deeper than we were possibly able to get even, tiny bit into tonight, but I feel like we've opened up so many really, really critical conversations. I'm gonna try to get through these next 3 questions in 15 minutes. Let's all like make a, well, I don't know, people agree. Let's try to make a pact to do that together. And then we'll let the conversations kind of unfold one-on-one as people have time. Does that sound good to y'all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So we brought up speculation once, and you know, we talked about the history of sort of handing the housing market and the housing system over to private entities more and more so over time. So if we identify speculative finance as the enemy of the tenant, and I think that's something the housing movement has done, maybe not going to Washington so much, but taking it to Wall Street. My question is, as policymakers and as planners, other than a vacancy tax, what is something that you've heard of or that you're excited about that we can do to stand up to speculative finance in cities?
I'll start, although I have to be honest, other than land use policies that extract resources from developers, which is a lot and which is near at hand, I don't think any city has really done a very good job at holding the corporate sector accountable. I thought the play at the beginning of the session was amazing, right? It really set the tone for exactly what you're asking in your question. And I'm wondering how many folks are aware that Warner Music Group is now in DTLA? So Warner Music Group had $4 billion in revenue last year. This is one of the largest entertainment conglomerates in the world. And they're at 7th in Mateo. We're at 3rd in Broadway. They're closer to Skid Row than we are, geographically, I would say. And they are going to transform the neighborhood. And if protections are not put in place, and requirements and clawbacks and basic standards of what the landowners owe to the people who live here now are not established, Warner Music Group and all the others who are coming after them are going to turn this into downtown Disney. And we know that. So that's one answer, is we have to use the DTLA 2040 process to control as best we can how land is used. But at the end, and this is where I may differ with some folks in the room, that's a necessary fight, but at the end of the day, people who deal in real estate, developers, they're not in business to get to heaven. If they were, they wouldn't be doing much of what they're doing. Right? They're in business to make money. And no matter what protections we put in place, if they can make more money buying up property and flipping it into, you know, high rent condos or co-ops or other things, they're going to do it because there's money to be made. And if the federal government and local government, county government isn't giving them an incentive to build affordable housing, then they won't. And so they don't. And now the public sector doesn't do it either, which means nobody is doing it, which means there's no new stock being created. And that's a big reason why we've got tens of thousands of people with nowhere to go, and tens of thousands more will be joining them if we don't do something about it.
I just want to say a couple quick things to keep this really short. One, telling the story is so important. So, I mean, thank you to the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. If I say the name right at like this hour of the night, I'm like, I'm not sure if I'm getting it right. But telling the story is incredibly important. The performance before this, the data, we've got to tell the story because people don't understand how much the housing market has changed. And so one of the things that really heartened me was that for AB 1482, our first statewide tenant protections, probably in my lifetime. We have not had statewide tenant protections. All we've done is weekend tenant protections at the state level for decades. For the first time, we saw a statewide tenant protection this year. And they said it has to apply to single-family homes owned by institutional investors. And that's because of the data, because of the incredible work researchers like you have been doing to help people understand. You know, when you say single-family home, it's not your Uncle Joe who owns that single-family home. Yes, some individual people own single-family homes, but an extraordinary number have been bought by Wall Street. And the fact that that story made it to Sacramento and made it into law is so astounding because it's been so hard. So telling the story is incredibly important because people don't understand what's happening. The other thing I just want to say, I just want to put a plug in for the Communities in Schools Act, an incredibly important initiative that's coming up on the 2020 November election to try and stop some of the loopholes that institutional investors have been getting in commercial properties because of Prop 13, which has been the third rail since 1978. And there will be tens of millions, probably hundreds of $millions spent against this measure that's trying to collect an adequate amount of property tax from institutional investors who own commercial properties. It's astounding the loopholes that exist today. And we're finally in November 2020 going to be able to vote on something to try and recoup some of those profits. So I do think we're starting to see a few tools, which is heartening. And I hope we'll see a lot more as we sort of change what people think is politically possible.
Is it gonna be healthy, not bug infested and rat infested like these are now? I mean, just say they give us smallpox infested blanket, okay, killing us all. The corners that these SROs left ran picking up bodies more than picking up bodies on the street. So what do you call, are you giving us housing? Are you giving us housing or are you giving us our deathbed? Okay? Now, second question is, the managers, if they don't like you, the way you look, or like your attitude, they just kick you out. This is a revolving door. Ain't nobody that really gets housing is gonna get a fair shake at this. It's all about money. Y'all making money of housing us. We can house our damn selves.
All right.
I just want to say that was an incredibly important point, and I want to say two things about it. One, I want to say legal protections matter, and this is, oh, it's not. So I would just want to say two quick things. Legal protections matter, and this is also one of the reasons why, well, I want to get people off the streets quickly. I'm also really aware when someone goes into shelter, they don't have legal protection. When somebody goes into permanent supportive housing, they do have tenants' rights, which means that they have legal recourse if they try and get removed from that housing for something other than a lease violation. It doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean that there's not abuses that take place, but at least there's a legal process. And I just have heard so many heartbreaking stories of people who were kicked out of programs because they were told they weren't supposed to wear a hat when they walked in the door, or they weren't supposed to have a, they weren't supposed to come in past a certain hour. And so the legal protections that happen when somebody has tenancy rights are really important. That said, we spend way too much time focusing on how many units are we building and not looking at what's happening in the units we're already operating. There's thousands of units of affordable housing, and everybody applauds developers when they open a new building, but we're not paying enough attention to the existing stock and what is happening there. And is there the on-site property management? Are they doing, and there's lots of, I've met some property managers are my heroes, because that is not an easy job, being a property manager in supportive housing. But there isn't enough attention to making sure that we are treating people right when they're the tenants of supportive housing. There's an incredible power imbalance, and I'm grateful for the legal protections because they really help. But I also think we need to pay a lot more attention. We need to pay property managers better so that they are people who are skilled and driven by their passion to really create healthy communities for people. And it always breaks my heart that we don't spend enough time really making sure that we're, maintaining a building built 20 years ago to be as healthy an environment as it should be.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I really don't mean to do this, but I live in Hacienda Heights. I'm on the bus, and I have to go, and I do apologize. I sincerely apologize. Besides, we're all out of pancakes.
All right, bring it home with our final question.
My name is Foxy, F-O-C-C. The community sees what's going on. They see, and it's come to a point. That company you mentioned, they can be there or not, but I tell you, it's come to a point. I do business with Jesus. It's coming to a point where this stuff is going to end. These panels. all this stuff is going to end. And we can't come to a conclusion to what our positions are about. From what I see, these positions that these people have taken, that these white folks have taken on, Big Mama and Big Papa. You know, everybody wanna be the big dog, they bring their children in, they walk in people's establishments. I'm one of Skid Row's finest independent artist, writer, and performer. And I get charged for ice. And these people know that I'm an artist. And as an artist, I'm a big deal. I am a big deal. I fought my way up, I earned my rights. And I kid you not, I might be a poor, dark-skinned black woman, I may be dark. But these panels have been going on for long enough. And if you have not came to a conclusion as to what your position allows you to do, you know, and that's just all I have to say. I'm not
Step-by-step actions, what you
I would like to respond to thank Foxy for that point, and to make a quick observation, building on the point I made earlier and comparing us to other social movements. As though it would need to be stated, I think it's self-evident. I think the anti-poverty movement in the United States, the homelessness sector and others, stand in sharp contrast to any other movement you would think of. And we've been, frankly, less successful than practically ever. We've been in a rearguard losing fight for a long time if you think about poor people in the United States and what we've lost from any point where you can pick this up from the welfare reform debate of the 90s, the destruction of public housing and so forth. My analysis of one of the reasons why is we are one of the few social justice sectors that does not have the people who are affected by what we're trying to address in any kind of leadership role. That it would be absurd if this were a panel on immigrant rights, for instance, and I was the one doing most of the talking, or the LGBT movement was led by straight people, or the women's movement was led by men. I mean, that would just be absurd, and yet when it comes to poor people, there has never been serious efforts to build the leadership and recognize. And I applaud the LA Poverty Department. It's one of the few places in town, LA CAN is one of the few places in town that recognizes the importance of that not on a symbolic level, but that we will not win if we don't figure out what Fox is talking about.
This is it. This is your final chance to say something. We're going to move into one-on-one conversations after this. This is obviously. I mean, I've had my mind blown. I think obviously that this ending is very kind of like chastening in a certain sense. Like, okay, like it's great to talk about these things. This is like, there's a lot to think about, but there's obviously just so much work to do. This is the very beginning, really, of a project we're doing with LAPD. Looking at this issue and trying to have real impact on the way that Skid Row is the land use process unfolds, and that is a running timeline. It's going now. So I hope that anyone who's in this room who was fired up, interested, angry, curious, any of those feelings, stays connected to this and stays connected to that process, so that we can actually have some real change happen here. I want to thank these panelists for giving their time to us tonight and answering our questions, hearing our thoughts. I want to thank all of you for making the time in your life to have this conversation as well. And we can continue it informally after this, and then informally as our lives move forward. Thank you all so much.